The greatness of Europe has been its public life, which has been related to the fact that it's been a Christian continent. Western civilization is simply Catholic Christendom 500 years on after the Reformation. So if that kind of moral and ultimate religious cohesion is lost, then it becomes much harder to live as part of a community with somebody.
Very grateful and excited to have James Carb with us today, who is a lawyer, independent scholar, and Catholic convert. He wrote a fantastic book called The Tyranny of Liberalism, published by ISI Books in 2008, and more recently, Against Inclusiveness, How the Diversity Regime is Flattening America and the West, and What to Do About It. James, thanks so much for agreeing to speak.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Now, you've written a lot about liberalism. What do you mean by liberalism, and what is the essence of conservative opposition to it?
Yeah, well, liberalism is really the idea that the highest standard in politics is equal freedom, where equal includes whatever dimensions you can work in, because you can't have equality in all respects. And freedom means freedom to do whatever you want, arbitrary freedom. So it's not like various classical ideas of freedom, where it had to do with the good life or with the independence of a city or whatever. So, and it tries to, contemporary liberalism, as opposed to classical liberalism, tries to get that organized. So it sets up this whole state bureaucracy, which tries to implement that through all the details of life, so that it ends up supervising all aspects of life and all human relations and everything people think and say, so that nobody interferes with other people's freedom, and nobody oppresses anybody in any way by thinking less of him, so that everybody has equal social status and so on. And the problem with that is that the attempt to do that means that the things people are allowed to want become trivial, because they have to be things that don't affect other people. So you end up with a society like the one we have, in which you're allowed to pursue consumer goods, or watch videos, or pursue personal lifestyles that don't affect other people much, because they don't depend on other people. But you're not allowed to pursue any of the things, in principle, you're not allowed to pursue any of the things that people have in fact cared for, like close, dependable relations with other people, like marriage, or with membership in a particular culture that has some definition and continuity that you can rely on in your dealings with the people around you, and or God, religion, because after all, if God is anything, he's the ultimate standard, and that isn't the same standard as doing whatever it is you feel like doing. So you end up with this trivial way of life that's enforced on all of us, and that crowds out everything anybody has ever cared about. And that's a human catastrophe. And so conservatism is a bunch of different things. It's resistance to that on a number of different grounds, because there are different parts of it that different people take exception to. Some people like the basic concept of equal freedom, but they don't think the government should be quite so active and forcing it into every nook and cranny of social life. Other people think that, well, really, you can't have a good life with other people unless you have a common understanding of what the good life is. And so liberalism makes that impossible to realize. And so they don't like liberalism in a much broader and deeper way than the first group, are really the classical liberals. And so it goes. I mean, depending on what you don't like about liberalism, you become that kind of conservative.
Listening to those comments, I was thinking that autonomy and the idea that you get to determine what is good for you and live life in your own way is really at the heart of what liberalism is all about. But it sounds like from what you were explaining that it ends up with an attack on freedom. It's decidedly anti-liberal in how it actually plays out.
Well, that's right, because man is social. We're social beings, and so that most of the things we actually care about have to do with our relations with other people. And liberalism says that well, all those have to be left completely free and completely undetermined, and completely what's the expression? Well, they can't have any stability, and that's not good for people, and it doesn't make people happy. So that the autonomy it gives us is autonomy that doesn't really help us become who we are or to live the lives that we want.
Right. And you can see, for example, in the 5 decades or so since the Second World War, real incomes went up by about 4 times, but depression increased around tenfold. So the idea that if you just set people free of any kind of meaningful human relationships and dependency and say, go be autonomous, make your own happiness, doesn't really seem to work.
No, it's not a sensible thing to do, and a little bit of thought shows that. But it's become institutionalized as the logic of public discussion, so it's extremely difficult to escape.
Well, let's talk a bit more about how it became institutionalized. One of your comments that caught my eye in your writing is that liberalism is based on the immediate promise of pleasure, of giving people what they want, while conservatism is not. Now, that immediate promise of pleasure is connected to the sexual revolution. How did that help to establish liberalism so firmly in the media, for example, in popular culture?
A couple of different ways. One way is that, of course, the sexual impulse is very strong, and so that a theory that tells you that, well, gee, you ought to just pursue it. You shouldn't accept any limitations on it. Has some immediate appeal. Now, in fact, of course, it doesn't work out that well. But again, we're talking about the immediate appeal that leads people into it. And even if it doesn't work out that well, how do you limit it? What restrictions do you put on it? How are they? How are they enforced? The fact that the attempt has been made to loosen all restrictions make it very hard to reestablish them, because people disagree what's needed. Some people suffer more than others. People have different theories about what should be done, so that nothing ever gets done. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is that the sexual revolution weakens connections among people, because it means that families become less stable. The sexes become more suspicious of each other, because they can no longer rely on each other in this very basic part of life that people certainly take very much to heart. And so with looser connections among people, the idea that really we're just separate atomized pursuers of pleasure becomes more realistic. We can't form bonds with each other, so of course we're just pursuing our own advantage, and that's the basic sort of metaphysics of the human being that's behind liberalism. That we're individual actors, each of us pursuing whatever it is that we happen to want. And the purpose of the system is to sort of accommodate that and prevent conflicts from becoming too severe, and to the extent possible, facilitating everybody in his pursuit of whatever he thinks his bliss is. So, the sexual revolution certainly did advance liberalism. Also, it makes it harder for people to get their lives organized. And so, since it's harder to get life organized without, for example, the structure of a solid family system, then there's more reliance on the state bureaucracy to organize things. And the state bureaucracy doesn't really have any moral views about anything. It just wants to do these very basic things like keep people from open conflict and making sure people don't die of disease. So that, again, just the way people carry on their lives becomes much more consistent with the idea that there's no real moral bonds among each other, no common good, but rather particular individuals, each one of them pursuing whatever it is he happens to want.
So we've got two tendencies towards an increase in the size and strength of the state there. We've got, on the one hand, the breaking of the bonds between people, leading to social chaos and dissolution, and the state having to mop that up.
Right.
We've also got, on the other hand, the ever proliferating rights claims that have to be enforced somehow, have to be protected. And the more of those we get, the bigger the state's role in defending them for people. So liberalism on two counts is tending towards an increase in the managerial power of its own regime.
Well, yes, that's where it ends up. It started off with the 19th century with an idea of minimal government, but of course that turned out to be impossible. And in fact, the current dynamic is to have the government run everything. That was the basis of the title of my first book, The Tyranny of Liberalism, because in the long run, it really leaves no significant scope for freedom. It just gives us freedoms that don't matter.
Certainly. And there's a sense in which liberalism is simply consistent classical liberalism. It's the unfolding of the inner logic of the idea.
Well, yeah, that's right. People try to draw the line, but it never works. And people tried to take a stand as libertarians who insist on a minimal state, but that collapses because the logic of viewing people as individual utility maximizers who have no intrinsic connection to each other leads to that. You have no structure, immediate everyday structure involving people like family life, kinship, community, based on common culture. So instead of that, some more larger, more objective, and more inhuman structure, the managerial state has to step in to keep things organized, and that's what's happened.
Right. You can't draw a line in the metaphysical quicksand of autonomy. It doesn't work.
Yeah, it's logic. Logic is extremely simple, and the principles are extremely abstract. They're content free, and so therefore, there's no real way to say, well, gee, that isn't really what we meant, or that's not common sense, because they just generate this endless stream of arguments that, given what has already been granted, are just irrefutable.
Well, an example of that would be the transgenderism phenomenon, for example, which is, in a sense, a reductio ad absurdum of this idea of autonomy, because all they're really asking for is autonomy from biology, the freedom to determine themselves as they see fit according to their own private conception of the good.
Well, yeah, because up to before then, it basically been autonomy from culture, that is to say, from expectations and standards that have developed to allow people to live a better life together. They want autonomy from that, and that was liberalism. That was the first sexual revolution. And now that's not enough. It has to be autonomy from the physical reality of human bodies. You have to be able to reprocess them so that you can make of yourself whatever you want, because otherwise you're being oppressed.
That's it. Oppression by reality. And if we contrast the Catholic anthropology of human beings to this vision of radical autonomy that you've been outlining so clearly, well, we see that the Trinity is one of the keys to understanding reality, and that we're fundamentally relational beings, and to be a man or to be a woman is to be called to a particular form of loving self-sacrifice within marriage and the family. That's where people are fundamentally fulfilled. The family is the original social cell. It's the core building block of society, not the atomized individual.
Well, that's always been recognized. You can find statements like that all over the world, in China and India, everywhere, that human society begins with the primordial community of the family, because man by himself is not even a complete biological being, because he can't reproduce by himself. So in order to become anything that's going to thrive, he has to be joined sexually. And that union, the union in marriage, combines all the levels of human existence, because it combines the physical with the emotional, with impulse, with ideals, with intense immediate experience, and also with the continuity of humanity throughout time, and with the creation of new life, which brings in this sort of metaphysically and religiously profound event where a new human being comes into being, who then has to be cared for and raised to become a full member of society and to go forward and continue the process. So turning that all into a matter of individual choice is absurd. It's part of what makes us what we are. And the transgender movement, to the contrary, notwithstanding, we don't create ourselves. And we're not going to be happy if we pretend we do.
Very well put. Certainly is the case that we don't get to decide what we are as created beings, despite some of the aims at the heart of the Enlightenment to the contrary. You can see the idea that man is master of nature, leading to the idea that man is also master of human nature and can recreate himself according to whatever image of himself he has in mind, rather than accepting the fact that God created us male or female. Autonomy is ultimately a kind of challenge to God's order.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because there's two sort of principles that come together that seem like they conflict. There's the idea of man as this divine being that creates himself, but then there's also man as the object of technology. Because in order to create yourself, you have to be able, in the transgender case, to perform all these operations on you, to drug your body, to do these things, to transform yourself. And then in society at large, the managerial state supposedly promotes people as these sort of sacred self-creating beings. But the way it does that is by manipulating them and treating them as objects of social technology. So there are these astounding contradictions at the heart of the project, that of course, don't work.
On that note of things not working, you've made the interesting comment that the relation between men and women is fundamental to social order, and that we should not expect order anywhere if something so basic is disordered. Your comments on the family as the foundation of social order help to explain why you think that. But what kind of forms of disorder has liberalism produced in the relation between men and women?
I think I've mentioned that it causes suspicion. The sexes don't think they can rely on each other. And part of this is this ideal of freedom, which overrides something like marriage, or the idea that men and women owe something special to each other. The ideal of equality, men and women can't owe anything special to each other, because after all, they're just free and equal beings, each of whom can determine what he is and what his happiness will be, which can change from time to time. People are always free to change. In fact, change is celebrated. So that the basis for trust and cooperation between the sexes disappears because, it is difficult. In some relationships so close, there's a lot of vulnerability, and you're taking a risk. You have to trust the other person, and if you can't do that, then well, you'll be unhappy. It'll develop all sorts of bad behavior because people become manipulative, or they become some people get in the habit of being abused, which is also a way of carrying on your life, which is horrible. The So it leads to that sort of disorder between the man and woman, and then of course there are the children, who rely on their parents having a stable, positive relationship. Because for them, their parents define their world. And their world is composed of people who basically can't be trusted and who don't trust each other, and who you provide no good way of life to work toward, to aspire to model yourself on. Then that's obviously a catastrophe for children. So that it makes the parents unhappy, it makes the children unhappy. It means that the children grow up. Well, they might be inspired by their unhappy childhood to do better, but it's hard to do better unless you've seen it, and unless you've had something to model yourself on, and they've been deprived of that, and that just cascades throughout the whole of society. I think in England, there's this absurd graphs of the number of crimes. After the war, there were hardly any. Today they've skyrocketed because people have become much more disordered in their lives and how they go about treating other people, and what they expect and what they think they can expect. And the development has plainly been horrible. Our public authorities have done a terrible job of looking after the common good. It's outrageous. It's beyond outrageous. And part of that goes back to family structure, which again partly has to do with the theory of things that's expected. And part of the theory, I have to say, is that it's supported by powerful institutions. Because if people are incompetent, atomized individuals who just want to get whatever they want and can be ruled by carrot and stick tactics because they don't have any other standards, then money and bureaucratic power rule everything. So that from the standpoint of billionaires and bureaucrats, there's a tendency not to want family life to be anything very strong, or local community life to be anything very strong. Because after all, that means there are all these people out there making up their minds and living without much reference to them. They would rather that everything was either administered by the state or bought and sold by money, because then all social life flows through institutions they control. So from that standpoint, the current version of liberalism is clearly an ideology in the Marxist sense. That is to say, it's a theory of things that explains why the most powerful institutions should run everything, and why nobody else should be allowed to have any power, and no other institutions should be tolerated. Because it's the established institutions that have the expertise, and they know what things are about, and they can manage things so that everybody's treated fairly. Whereas if you let people do things, why, these people don't know anything, and they'll just abuse each other, and that can't be allowed. So we have to stop that. And I really do think that's a large part of the explanation of why things have become as they do. We have this hypertrophy of extremely powerful institutions based on bureaucracy and money, which think they can run things best, and therefore nobody else should be running things. And the habits and understandings and traditions that enabled them to run them ought to all be abolished. And that's what we're seeing.
This is reminding me of points made by people like G.K. Chesterton, Christopher Dawson, that capitalism, no less than communism, has undermined family life because essentially laissez-faire capitalism is just liberalism in economic form. And if you're making the market the dominant social institution, then it's amoral. There's no kind of value system built into that. It's whatever people happen to create profit via is okay.
Well, yeah, it's just human beings as individual utility maximizers dealing with each other through money, or else to the extent you bring the state in through state power, which is supposedly guided by expert bureaucrats, who are in possession of all the proper standards, who know how best to manage things so that people will be peaceful and they'll get what they want.
Mm.
And it's all insane, really. But it's where public discussion is. I think the basic principles on which public discussion is carried on now lead that way. And it's very hard to argue seriously against it and say things that will sound reasonable. If they're put on the average TV program, they're just at odds with how everything is discussed.
Well, pursuing that line of thought, then let's take a question that's a good example of creating difficulties in trying to argue against the mainstream position. Why should anyone care what consenting adults do in private?
Well, my wife certainly cares what I do in private with consenting women. And I would also care about that sort of thing. And our children would care about that as well, since they want their parents to live decorous, upright lives. And my children are actually all self-supporting now, but while they were growing up, I think the whole world has a right to care whether we're carrying on our family life in a way that is going to work, because after all, we have the responsibility of raising children and of supporting each other. And if we don't do that in a reasonably functional way, that's going to be a lot of problems for everybody. So that other people obviously do care, have a right to care what consenting adults do in private, because the effects spill over, because the things we do in private are so important and so basic to our lives. How could they not care?
That's a good answer. What happens in private doesn't stay private, especially regarding sexual matters, because they can produce new members of society who are dependent and are going to need education, support, protection, etc. Now, this sounds like there is a standard of sexual morality that is there, and if people disagree with it, then they're just wrong. Ultimately, there's something objective about this. How is that enforced, though? Are we going to send the state into people's bedrooms? Aquinas argued that not even prostitution should be illegal, and it's not the function of the law to punish all vice. I mean, how could you ever do such a thing?
Yeah, well, the enforcement is obviously subsidiary, because people think about this thing in the wrong way, because they think about people as if they were the liberal individual utility maximizer. So therefore, they think that if you're going to have standards and expectations, what that means is you have some government department that draws up what the regulations are, and then they draw up some way to provide a collection of carrots and sticks to get people to comply with them. And obviously, that's not anything that's going to work in this department. What you need is, first of all, a social understanding of what men and women are. of what they have a right to expect from each other, of what they owe each other, of how families can work, of what children have a right to expect from their parents and parents from their children. And so based on that understanding of what life is, for men, for women, for children, and what people are, then the enforcement flows fairly naturally. Because if somebody acts in a way that violates that expectation, then somehow or other, as in other cases where people are act in ways that are thought disgraceful, pressure will be put. I mean, people will say things. In egregious instances, there could be some sort of criminal prosecution. Obviously, it's a matter of prudence. Whether that's a good idea. And Aquinas had his own views on that, which were comparatively to keep rather loose rein from the standpoint of criminal prosecutions. But at some point that's going to happen. But otherwise, there are all sorts of social pressures that are put on people. It's astounded me, for example, how successful the effort to get rid of smoking has been. Because that's been that's an actual addiction. People found it very hard to quit. But even so, everybody did because it became socially disreputable. It wasn't that it became illegal or that there was this, there were various rules that were imposed that made it more awkward to smoke. Like smoking cars were eliminated on trains, and there were rules that you couldn't smoke in a restaurant and so on. But even so, I think those lagged the change in attitudes. So that what's important is the common understanding of how things should be, how people should live, and then the enforcement comes second. And it's going to be partial and a little bit haphazard, but it's going to be real and it's going to be an essential part of the picture. But it's not going to be the primary thing.
So if you have a correct philosophical anthropology of what a human being is, then the standards you expect flow from that. And we've got the reality of shame as a powerful social motivator. And it's interesting, isn't it, that if the liberal view of human beings were correct, we would expect promiscuity to work just fine. There's no reason why it shouldn't if we're all just individual pleasure maximized. I mean, why not? So the fact that it is so disastrous functions as a kind of reductio ad absurdum. Look at the consequences for children, for example. Look at the consequences in terms of depression, divorce, all the rest of it. This view of human beings doesn't match the reality, and promiscuous unions don't work. So there must be something else. If we go back far enough, what's the mistake? And it's the fact that we aren't these autonomous, isolated, atomized beings. We're built for the mutual promise of fidelity in marriage for the procreation, education of children.
Yeah, that's what we're built for. And it's not just guilt, by the way. It's not just shame, by the way. It's also how you look at yourself. If I am unfaithful to my wife, then I am violating what I am. I see myself as dishonored. As I see myself as in my every act lying to my wife. So that's not shame exactly. It's a feeling that something basic has been put out of order, so that your life is no longer something that has the harmony that it should. Everything has become false. And so that's another aspect, sort of the internal aspect. That if you have the right view of human beings, then to act badly is to violate what you are. And therefore, it's something you want to get rid of. Even though, we all fail and all that. Often we all fail, but at any rate, there is that motive, which is real.
In a nutshell, that's a great description of natural law. Violating what we are is going contrary to natural law, whereas acting consistently with the contours of what we are as rational beings is going to make us flourish. Really interesting point about how shame and guilt work like pincers together. That's important. Let's pursue it a bit. Who are other people to say what sexual conduct is right for me? I think you made a good case there that we don't have purely private acts because we're not autonomous individuals, but who gets to decide what's right for me?
Well, every society has standards. I have no special right to decide for some guy who lives down the street, on my own, what he ought to be doing. But you can certainly have public discussions of what standards make sense and how people should live. And, one way or another, standards are created. For example, there's been a big emphasis lately on Me Too, like the standard of, I suppose, not putting too much pressure on women to accommodate a man sexually. There's an example, even in our time, of a standard emerging because people feel that something's a problem. And then people talk about it, and the social standard shifts or becomes more emphatic or becomes more emphatically enforced, so that it's not again the question. Who are other people to decide? Suggests that man is not social.
Mm.
That we're individual utility maximizers, and therefore, how can other utility maximizers decide what I, as a utility maximizer, should do? And obviously, they have no special right to do that. But we're social. We depend on other people. We live by our connections with other people. So therefore, and we're also rational, which means that our views of what we are or what should be play an important role in our connections with other people. And those views are not only individual, but common to others. And that's how they function. That's true in every society, including our own. Even today, even more today in some respects. Since socially, the penalties on saying all sorts of things have become much stiffer over the years, as I think you found out. But
yeah, certainly did.
But so that the question is the question, who are others to decide, is based on an unreal understanding of human beings.
That's very well put. These common objections to liberalism, common objections from liberals to any non-liberal understanding of human beings, as sneaking in these liberal premises as the basis of the objection. Another one is that we don't even get to decide what is good for ourselves, because that's not up to us fundamentally. The kind of creature we are is just a given. You can't pick and choose from an infinite array of lifestyles and have them all be equally good for you. There is a set way that is going to lead to your fulfillment, and that's it. Pursuit of knowledge and pursuit of virtue, that's the telos, or the final cause of human beings, given the fact that we are rational. So the answer to Nietzsche's famous question, why truth, is that that's what we are built for. And truth and morality, or rationality and morality, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. So you were talking about being true to yourself as one of the motivations for loyalty to your wife, for example, the importance of correct sexual behavior. That's a kind of pursuit of the truth, isn't it? Just in the same way as reading or discussion is in the intellectual life.
Well, yeah. I mean, Yeah, it's dishonest to violate your obligations to your wife. That you're living a lie, and that's a terrible thing. Um, so yeah, the two are very closely connected because uh, yeah, again, natural law to live well is to live by the truth of human beings and human life. And therefore, to live badly is, among other things, to lie by denying through your actions what is true about you and about the world and about the human world.
Right. So that will help us to explain then the answer to the other common objection, which is why can't people with differing standards just live side by side? I mean, why not just accept gay marriage, for example, or some of the radical feminist attacks on the family? Why not just accept them?
Well, people with different standards can live side by side, but not as part of the same community. Uh, you end up with something like they have in the Middle East, where you have this radically cosmopolitan society with very different religious ethnic groups living next to each other. But of course, they don't agree on a good way of life. So therefore, those societies have always been radically divided into people who live in separate communities with actual walls around them. And of course, that's had political effects. The governments have generally been weak despotisms. They've been military autocracies. A sultan is basically a military autocrat because they didn't have enough common standards to carry on a productive and rewarding social life together. And so that's what happens. There's been discussion recently of in a popular book. There's a man named Rod Dreher wrote the Benedict option, which was about the need for in the present world for close-knit Christian communities. And that's the response to that kind of situation, that the commonly accepted public culture simply does not provide a basis for living a good life because there's not enough aspects of the good life agreed upon to provide standards to live by. And so therefore, if you want to live a good life, you're going to have to become somewhat of a social dropout to some extent. And live with other people who share more of a common vision, and that's not ideal. I mean, the greatness of Europe has been its public life, which has been related to the fact that it's been a Christian continent. Western civilization is simply Catholic Christendom 500 years on after the Reformation. And so if that kind of moral and ultimate religious cohesion is lost, then it becomes much harder to live as part of a community with somebody. And people need to live as part of a community because they're social beings. So that means radical social division that nothing much can be done about.
There's an argument, isn't there, that the Reformation was liberalism in religious form and fractured the unity of Catholic Europe. We go back far enough, and there it is.
Yeah, it did. And part of the Reformation, of course, was the rise of the secular state, the idea that the most authoritative, like the highest social authority was really the king or the prince. And so from its beginning, liberalism has been associated with state power over all aspects of life, because if it has power over religion, if the state has power over religion, which is what the claim of the reformers was, that's certainly what Henry VIII said, then then it has power over all aspects of social life. So these tendencies can be traced way back, and in a way that makes it difficult because it's not that the wrong guy won the election 5 years ago. It goes a lot deeper than that, and so rebuilding from where we are is going to be a huge project. But I think the more clearly we realize that, the better off we'll be. If you're in a situation that has huge difficulties, you're better off knowing what the difficulties are.
Definitely. Aristotle's point that small mistakes in the beginning lead to big ones in the end, I think, is important to bear in mind here. Most people now can see there are some big problems, but retracing our steps to figure out where the small initial errors were is going to be very important. Regarding rebuilding, given your comments about the importance of the relation between men and women, marriage is obviously going to be vital. What would you say to people who think it's purely a legal convention or fiction, just a piece of paper? How come religion has to get involved?
Well, it's obviously more than a fiction, because what you're doing is getting up publicly and joining your life to the life of another person in a way that implies that you're going to be having children. And so you're building this new social cell, and that's at the basis of the social order. And by doing so, you're integrating, as we discussed, everything from your physical being, your emotional being, your instinctual being, to all sorts of ideals of what people should be and of what life is about. And you're taking that integrated unity of two people that exists to some degree, at least at all levels, and you're giving it a dimension in time whereby it continues what your ancestors did, and it looks forward to your descendants. So it's this very basic thing in human life that's much more than a convention, and religion enters into it because you're creating this new reality where you're joined to your wife. She is obviously part of your family as much as your sister is. More than your sister is, because she's closer to you, and the connection's more important. And it seems insane to say that, well, if I decide my sister isn't my sister, that doesn't work. But if I decide my wife isn't my wife, that does work. That makes no sense at all. So that to explain how it can have that sort of authoritative being that changes what we are and changes something so fundamental in our connection to other people, I think that's how religion enters into it. Because people say, well, this is this divinely instituted relationship, that has its own reality that can't be reduced to what the parties want. And like even well, okay, well, that's a tangent. I won't follow that. But so that that sort of minimalist understanding of marriage doesn't make sense. Also, as a practical matter, sociological matter, in fact, living together situations are much less stable than marriages. And people talk about domestic violence, about abuse of children. Those are far more common in non-marital households than in marriages. Like the proportion between children who are abused by father versus children who are abused by boyfriend is like 70-1. It's an absurd disproportion. The two things are just very different humanly. And so this is, and oddly, that wasn't known to social scientists for a long time because none of them thought it was worth looking at. The way of looking at human beings was just so mechanistic that they couldn't bring into their research something that's a basic common sense understanding of ordinary human beings, that marriage is important, because it wasn't quantitative, and it was hard for them to describe abstractly in the terms they're used to using. So marriage matters, and everybody knows it matters, and its decline or its conversion into this luxury good for rich, successful people is a social catastrophe. Before, the poorest people could have this dignified place in an important social institution where they had real authority and real responsibilities. The decline of marriage has deprived them of that. That's been horrible. And anybody who cares about people in the bottom rungs of society and doesn't care about that isn't thinking clearly.
Yeah, you can see the damaging impact of the breakdown of marriage most clearly in the poorest communities. Your comments there reminded me of the great line from Pope John Paul II that all of eternity passes through the family. That's why it's not merely a civic institution, but also a religious one. Because what doesn't it affect? And if we get our anthropology of man right, and human beings have as their final end God, then one of the big functions of marriage in the family is that the father is trying to get his wife and his children to heaven in the long run.
Yeah, so people build each other up that way. They rely on each other. They help each other. And the parents, are put on their mettle to give their children an example. I'm sure you've also known people, like men, who have really pulled their acts together when they got married and had children, because they're not just living for themselves or just for now. They're living also for their wife and their children, and for everything their children will be and aspire to. And understanding of that kind of responsibility has an enormous effect on people.
One of the reasons there is a crisis regarding masculinity today is because the sexual revolution severed what it is to be a man from what it is to be a father and the leader of a family. And so many men feel rootless and adrift without that responsibility that makes them step up and really become who they truly are, because the essence of manhood really is the potential for fatherhood. That's where men find themselves.
Yeah, you have a responsibility for looking after a household, supporting it, defending it, guiding it. That's the joint effort, but the sexes have different roles in that effort. Dad lays down the law, and mom provide. Dad lays down the law to a greater degree, and mom provides care and sort of softer forms of support to a greater degree. And it's a cooperative thing, and each appreciates the other, and the children feel they can rely on it, and it's a natural way for people to be, and you try to reverse that or do away with it because it's not equal. And it's like deciding that you think a car ought to run on vegetable oil because, after all, it has the same number of same energy value as gasoline. It just won't work.
Now, I can imagine someone listening thinking, this all makes sense, but I really don't like the idea of religion. I can see that liberalism has its problems, but I like the message it gives me that it's not a religion. But you've made the point that really liberalism is a kind of surrogate religion. It's not packaged that way, but that's what it turns out to be. In what way does liberalism end up being a kind of substitute or surrogate religion?
Well, there's always some sort of highest standard, highest value thing that's most worth making sacrifices for, and so on. There's always something, and in a liberal society, that's going to be the principle of equality and freedom. So that you can see this in the current. I don't know if in England you use the word woke very much.
We do.
But the extreme demands regarding equality and various forms of liberation, and the extreme abusiveness toward people who don't agree. Obviously, the people who are possessed by that view are treating their view as something that's true by virtue of the nature of reality. That to disagree with it is simply to be ignorant or malicious or to be a bad person, because that's the reality of things. So they believe that the nature of the reality imposes all these very specific moral demands that everybody's required to follow. And, you can't discuss them. You can't joke about them. You just have to compete with everybody else and, ever greater demonstrations of your total devotion to them. So that obviously functions as a religion. It gives people a highest standard in life. It tells them why they are good, how they can save themselves, how they can save the world. And so that, all this sort of free-floating freedom that people think they're going to get through liberalism simply isn't going to be there. Instead of a religion that takes into account how the world is, you get one that's based on the attempt to enforce arbitrary categories on everything, which is much more abusive, much more destructive, and has much less power to sustain people through problems. It simply does not work as well from the sociological standpoint of how religions work for people.
Right. And that's because really the problem is that it's not true, and it gets what human beings are fundamentally wrong. And I agree with you, that is how people act with the persecution of heretics, etc., and all these devotional rites, whether it's flying particular flags or taking a knee on various occasions. But isn't it funny that those same people will also claim that truth is relative and there's no real objectivity involved? So the extent to which they can even profess this religion consistently is very limited, impossible, I would say.
In the long run, yes. In the short run, they say, well, there really aren't any absolute goods. People pursue their own goods. But then, people equally have desires. Instead of having substantive goods, you have these formal requirements. Which, as in the case of Kant, has been the approach taken for a long time in dealing with loss of connection to God. So you have these formal requirements that, we all have desires, people equally have desires, so therefore their desires ought to get equal credence and equal support. And you have to restrict that somewhat, because you can only do that with tolerant desires. So that desires that don't seem to affect other people in an immediate way that's recognized by liberal institutions, like commercial institutions and bureaucracies, things that like becoming transgender. That's my desire, therefore I should get it, because it doesn't interfere with your not becoming transgender or somebody else becoming non-binary. So therefore, that's a good kind of desire, so it deserves support. So that, and if you deny that, then you're simply displaying the fact that you hate people who have that desire rather than some other desire, and so therefore, since you hate them simply for what they are, that's really something that's likely to lead to murder, and it shouldn't be allowed. So that the attempt to get rid of standards, given the fact that people have to do something and have to have some, they intrinsically demand some sort of reason for what they do, means that some other standard is going to be produced, and, which in this case is a formal standards of freedom and equality, which are ever more demanding.
And those standards can't really be rationally justified apart from a vision involving natural law and the objectivity of value and purpose anyway. You can't just pull these standards out of thin air and hope to ground them anywhere.
No, they have a problem ultimately. I guess I'd say that, short and middle term, they have very definite logic. But in the long term, they don't make much sense. Since, why should I care about them?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I can see how you can say that all desires should be equal, but so what?
Some people are thinking that we're now past the point of no return and there's no chance of going back to the old ways, no chance of any kind of common sense or coherent society re-emerging. What words of hope would you give to them?
Okay, well, one thing is, for the society as a whole, you just don't know. Things can happen that make everything look very different. And, the future is basically unforeseeable. But there seems to be a powerful logic between the tendencies that we've been living with. So, it could be true that the current social order can't be saved, but since it's turning into won't work, then what that means is some different social order, or more likely a bunch of little social orders, will arise and supplant it. The social order doesn't give people a tolerable way of life, so they'll find other ways of living a tolerable way of life, which, for a while I've been saying, well, you could end up with something like we've had in the Middle East, where you have a radically divided society composed of different groups of people who've developed their own way of life that's a lot more satisfying than the absolutely vacant and non-existent public culture. So, one way or another, either through an unforeseeable change in circumstances that makes everything look different, or else through decline and growing inability to function on the part of the social order, leading to a rebirth of smaller communities that function, which will then have to jar and fight with each other until something overall that can work arises.
Yeah, that's an important point, that really reality has the last laugh. And it wasn't that long ago that the Soviet Union collapsed, and people should take hope from that. Something that many people thought seemed impossible came about.
That's right. Of course, what happened when it collapsed was not that pleasant. So, you can't expect things to get wonderful very quickly. If social collapse is unpleasant, and it's a long, hard road to put things back together, but eventually it happens. And so in the long run, there's hope. In the short run, who knows? You just do the best you can.
That's a good message. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I really appreciate it. And there's lots of wisdom there for people to contemplate.
Okay, thank you for having me on. It's good to talk with you. It's good to talk through these things.
It certainly is. And people who've enjoyed the way you've outlined your thoughts about liberalism there. A reminder, you can get James's book, The Tyranny of Liberalism, and also Against Inclusiveness, his more recent one. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Bye.